Hello everyone, question and answer video today about statal armies from the late Roman times to the 14th century essentially. So I want to thank first of all the follower that I had a recent interaction with for other reasons that wanted to write me these questions that are very important actually for his background, even his work, so I'm more than pleased to answer it, also because they are very interesting questions, as a matter of fact, about probably in fact the statalization of armies and how this thing kind of went sinusoidally but back and forth in history, and that in my opinion represents it's a bit, I guess maybe I stimulated this question from the kind of content I made in general, as I believe, as a military historian, that first of all, like as a historian in general, that history should be first taught in the essentials and then moving into the more confined time and space, and then understanding it better. And very often you would be surprised, but we made multiple videos about this already, by how historiographically such essentials are not yet gotten right. In today's video we'll have more than one chance to criticize certain scholarly views about, or better non-views, properly the idea that certain aspects about our history, our civilization, have been ignored and or misunderstood, or properly not studied enough, and with the right perspective and the right intentions, I would say, the right curiosity, and not just what is history for the sake of revenue, but for the actual scientific pleasure of learning, which should be at the root of any kind of historical inquiry, in my opinion, before anything else. Right? It's fine to monetize it. It's fine to, I guess I'm doing myself, but it's not the primary reason. Right? Also, I don't make a living with this specifically, but I believe that in the broader sense, philosophically speaking, history should always be about, yes, we want to live in a better world. How do we do this? It's about, being wired to reality and how things really matter. So that's the first interest you should have as a historian, properly to realize that there's something out there that you can't quite dissociate from the factuality of the saying. It is to say, there is some evidence, and this evidence has been produced by real people in a real world. Right? So by speculating on things and using certain ideological interpretations that do not fit, that are preconceivedly employed to frame eventually that part of the evidence, what the evidence that fits in, and this happens more often than not, unfortunately. I would say that it may be one of the single greatest problems we're facing at this very moment, and probably will always face by certain dimensions. So it's actually more than one question. I will be reading first the whole. All right. So the thing here starts admittedly from an interest towards the 14th century. It says, I have so many questions about 14th century warfare floating around in my head. The main one that really blows my mind is that of statal armies before the 14th century. Moderns always imagined that the Romans and the medieval monarchs had tax-funded armies like our own. However, if I understood correctly, the Roman Republic required soldiers to provide their own armaments. Being a soldier was a privilege, and you had to pay for your own keep. Then eventually the question passes to another phase, is more narrow in time and space, let's say, or at least it starts from the about the understanding of the rise of the Condottieri in Italy. I will talk about it later, but this first part, let's give it a look, because it's important to get things right as a start. So there is an idea of statal armies that indeed is mostly attached to this modernistic prejudice of essentially before the Renaissance, the world was somewhat, a dark, ugly place where nothing existed. It was all chaos and hubris and anarchy and, people killing each other, and there was no state and therefore no order. Well, of course, this is not true by any stretch of the imagination. And I must say I've encountered my share of modernistic prejudices, properly from modernists, right? From actual, even scholars. I mean, people who, claim themselves to be military historians even, and still do not get certain essentials, right? First of all, much revolves around the idea of centralization, that this questions on statal armies require as a default, right? So first of all, every single kind of human community is regulated by some degree of central mechanism, right? So the idea that there is a time in human communitarian development where everybody was literally on their own, and there's no such a thing like a centralized control of some sort, is basically devoid of any scientific, philosophical, and historical evidence throughout all the whole spectrum of our understanding of the world and mankind, right? And of course, modernism is obsessed by the idea that by the Renaissance, there is this moment in which, centralized armies occur, everything is controlled finally by this super entity that was born, we don't understand well how, from a day to another, and that eventually that brought to the progress of civilization through that. This is also not quite the same. My discussions literally were like almost like children, like literally, as people were denying there was some kind of centralization in the first place, right? Some idea that the state fundamentally didn't have any form or physiognomy, was just for some reason out there completely decentralized. I mean, I have found actually university professors that had in theory, like literally PhDs, people that should have learned history correctly, that believed that in the Middle Ages, for example, everything was decentralized, right? And this, if a kid comes up with one of my examinations and says something like that, no further questions, please present yourself next time. Like this is such an elementary. I don't think it's even. At this point, it's not even necessary to go to university to know certain things. At least, with my experience. Of course, there is some kind of centralization, and this always existed because it's simply an inherent structure of command existing within human communities. Right? You have to have a leader. You have to have some stored resources, and this authority fundamentally must be preoccupied with command, but also with the distribution of the aforementioned resources, and has properly a goal that is connected to this. That is to say, it's properly a mean to an end. It's not a set notion that came out of nothing. It's literally a consequence of human intelligence that, of course, has to organize itself before carrying out something, having resources for it, motivation for it. And in the case of warfare, specifically also to get into something where you can't really make a lot of relativism about what, it's gonna go or not, because if you fail, you're gonna be killed, right? And that's yet another reason why, against any culturalist delusion, warfare is, as it is properly waged, the single most rationalized of human activities. That is to say, the reasons, the actions for it are, compared to any other political and social action, fundamentally the ones that, by pressure of the same, have the most show, if you want, the best of human intelligence. You would say, look at Biden and Afghanistan. This is another mistake, meaning that, Clausewitzingly speaking, of course, not just a war is a prosecution or a continuation of politics with other means, but of course there are various intensities of warfare. There are different, reasons to do certain actions that, first of all, are connected to politics. And of course, if you don't care about a certain scenario, you think that it's not important for but it can be a mistake, right? But the strictly military action and how it's carried out, it's by default enacted, in fact, by structures, by systems, by organizations that know how to carry that out with a discipline, with a training, and with a preset preset amount of notions that are destined to carry that out successfully. Civilizationally speaking, armies have been largely, the most efficient, basically almost always the most efficient branch of their of civilization by themselves, properly by relative standards. Like you see, I don't know, pick even the U.S. population compared to the IQ of the military. Well, that's higher than the average of the population. You do need people to do certain specific things in a heavily hierarchical and orderly and controlled structure that operates according to certain civilizational tools that have been essentially sedimented throughout the millennia to carry out something so dangerous, risky, but potentially retributing, like warfare, in the most effective of ways, right? So that always starts, and it's not a surprise that the history of civilization at large is also a history of war, because war has always given a dramatic has always been a dramatic civilizational booster, right? When that civilization, incidentally, in it didn't go destroyed, and that's exactly the point, right? There is a metus hostilis, there is a fear of the enemy, of the threat, that brings you under pressure not to think about bullshit, right? It's like when something, like an accident unexpectedly happens, and you realize that your brain start working like 10 times the speed before, because that's a state of danger, and that's what fundamentally also works like in communities, but in a different way, relatively. This adds to the fog of war and all these things, but still, for the military to be always one of the first civilizational tools to be developed properly, also because always remember this, that the military is not, this is another modernistic preconception, the military is not born as such, right, with a strict division of roles of a civilian society, of a military environment distinguished from each other. Clausewitsianly speaking, war is violence. That is, a simple act of violence is how you even bring in, in a tribal society, order through deterrence, right? It's literally the first need of any civilization, pacifying, right? Pacifying. If there is somebody that is still there, is threatening you, and you can't fundamentally negotiate with him, you take him out, or you're taken out by him. And that's what you have to be prepared to do at any time, because you may always fall into that, and you may diplomacy may fail, and you may have to to always be ready to enact a violent response to sometimes literally survive, other times just to solve a problem. War is by itself usually not the best of solutions statistically. Sometimes it is, as a matter of fact. It's just the quickest, right, in many ways. So that also is part of its deal. But what happens later because of an incorrect employment of the military is not a problem of the military, it's a problem of the politics that has used it. That is to say, there is not a military that does anything on its own. By Clausewitzian definition, politics controls the military imminently at every single time, in every single measure, completely, absolutely, totally, in every single instant. So whatever happens militarily has nothing to do with war per se. It has to do with the intention that has brought people to fight that war, right, and how they respond to that. And that's also why, more important than anything else in war is moral forces, right? Not even how much, material you had involved in it, even less technology per se. It's really about how much you want the thing, right? And wars also are fought in this sense in a much more rationalized way, for which if the asymmetry is too high and there is no other way to reverse that, to put the enemy in that condition of inferiority for you to compel him to fulfill your will, war will not be fought, because it turns out that humans are not stupid, right? Except those that believe that war is inherently either good or bad, and that of course have never found themselves in a real war, because at that point their intelligence would have been activated, right? As being stupid is not really, not being intelligent, but being intelligent not to make use of their own intelligence. And this unfortunately overlaps dramatically with the radical under-scholarization of the average person in the entire world, to say the least, as no country in the world even comes remotely close to provide an adequate education, right, for people. And most of the work you have to do on your own, without whining, getting in line, obeying, disciplining yourself, working hard, spitting blood, and sweating hard, and that's it, because nobody's going to make things for you. And if you think that, you are very, very, very mistaken, and that means to have already lost the initiative and to always fall most of the times on the losing side, as most people in fact do. So of course there were statile armies before the 14th century, but I wouldn't put a boundary even in the 14th century itself, right? The 14th century as such is a quite diverse century, as we will see now, especially in the second part of the question that deals with certain specific examples of this. I wouldn't set the trend, right? I made a video recently, some months ago, another question and answer one, that asked me fundamentally what was about the so-called infantry revolution, which was not a revolution by any stretch of the imagination. That means basically that series of tens of victories of solely infantry-based armies in the first half of the 14th century, before the Black Death arrived and cut, essentially most of the demographic and economical resources of the commoners, and brought to a refeudalization of warfare that, frankly, when infantry actually rises again in the mid-15th century, is essentially proletarians under the firm authority and subjection and command of the greatest princes of Europe, right? Which is something dramatically different from, the commoners, the peasants of the early 14th century that rose because they had gotten more numerous, more wealthy, and they exploited in certain areas of Europe only, by the way, so the weakness of feudal structures that were incidentally so in some places, and that carved out part of their own autonomy, if not independence. So there is this first bias that we have to violently eradicate from Western mentality, that is to say that the end of the Middle Ages brought to any kind of improvement to the average person's living standards. This is absolutely not true. This was nor a more democratic, nor a more popular, nor a more civic reality that it had been the 13th century in certain environments, the very early, maybe 14th century. The Renaissance is the elite triumphant, right? And this is broken only between 1789 and 1918, right? So it's something completely most people get wrong all the time. This is a prejudice that mostly has, I would say, well, it comes from a certain part of the West, because of certain national perspectives and confessional perspectives that wanted to portray the growth in power of certain countries at the time as a product of some sort of democratization or emancipation of the common people. And this is absolutely not true. It was not true at the time, but especially if there was any improvement, which on the long run, in absolute terms, but it existed, this was not really true in relative terms, right? Meaning that this was on some scale the emancipation of certain communities, but not necessarily of all the people who lived in them. One of the greatest mistakes is to pretend that infantry development had anything to do with democratic development. This is not true, and this is especially evident not just in the 14th century, at that point where there was the rise and fall in the range of essentially a couple of generations of this popular classes. But secondly, it's something you find in other periods in history whenever you found a crisis of the same classes altogether. This is something that you can see easily, I don't know, in the change from classical to Hellenistic warfare, for example, or from middle Republican to late Republican Rome, in a way. So setting here the a correct standard, saying, the statal army is fundamentally one that the state, of course, provides for. So this is kind of self-evident, and the question is absolutely aware of this, but it may not be entirely to others. Like, in properly, the idea that a state has the degree of centralization at that point, independently from the political, social elements that control that state, to provide for the moral and material forces to have a statal army. It is to say, an army that is fundamentally under the command of that state. Moral as material forces, because of course the first resource that in every army makes its own effectiveness is the same motivation that is taught through discipline, through training, through also indoctrination at times. I mean, it has to be, the more you nullify an individual and the more you transform it in a military machine, the more you have an effective army. And the greatest civilizations in history have produced this brilliantly, right? The military has to do, by its own definition, one thing and one thing only. That is to say, to wipe from the hell of the earth any trace of enemy physical resistance. And any other kind of diversion from this is a civilizational decline. That is to say, properly not understanding what the military is there for, what it should be doing, and how that is done. Right, and this is also what von Clausewitz teaches brilliantly from a strictly human and almost humanistic perspective. Is to say, if you also want to to save as many lives, humanitarianly speaking, as possible, you have to have a military that is capable of performing such things without blinking an eye, right? Because the weaker that is, and the longer the war goes on with no specific end, and it causes more innocent to die in it, right? So the question had gone with, moderns always imagined that the Romans and medieval monarchs had tax-funded armies like our own. Well, however, if I understood correctly, the Roman Republic required soldiers to provide their own armaments. Being a soldier was a privilege, and you had to pay for your own keep. Yes, this is the deal. It was always a mixed system, right? As much as there was centralization, there was somebody who essentially had at that point the resources through mostly taxes, right? However they were collected, right, on a territory, because that's also the prerogative of a state, right? You don't have a state if you don't have a territorial control on it, and of course, in that sense, you need the decisive moral support of the communities that exist in it. So when you look at essentially a the main turn is the late the second half of the 17th century. There we start having, for the first time, armies that were at least conceived for the first time to be entirely statal in nature. That is to say, it wasn't a matter of having like kind of local private forces to be levied to go alongside the rest of the army. That still kind of existed, but what was born with Louis XIV, if anything, is the only true revolution that ever existed in military terms, and that was completely, was fulfilled, at least for the majority of Western countries, with essentially 1 century later or so, with the rise of the nation state, where fundamentally the state took over the entire control of the communities, right? So that, especially in civil law countries, rights stem only from the state, juridically speaking, whereas in common law, things remain a bit like before, in part. That is to say, properly, there is the juridical idea that rights pre-exist state, and the state is called just to fundamentally protect them, and also violently if necessary, but that's that should be limited to a certain degree. There is also monarchy, of course, that here varies, depending on the institutions. Is it a monarchy, is it a republic? That's yet another thing, but it's the idea that a state fundamentally has now a a citizen army. That is to say, if you are the citizen of your country, you are eligible for military service, whatever the needs are, and this is and you have to do it because the state has the power essentially of carrying that out, which before the French Revolution didn't quite exist as such. Right now, I don't have time to digress on the extent of how much this is true, because this was paradoxically born, as we were saying, like with 17th century France, right, where properly there is the idea that there is an army that is fully statal in its own nature. That is to say, it's controlled completely from the top, and there is no essentially private intermediary in between, which in practice already existed, but also only because it's the state that subcontracts certain means, for example, supplying the troops, paying them, but those troops are statal per se, right? Whereas before it was just essentially a state negotiating with communities to provide a certain amount of forces, also asking privates, etc., and therefore not having the direct control on these forces per se, right? In practice, the transition is blurred, as you understand, because much of that subcontracting system was similar to the one of it, but to one of mercenary companies before, in a way. But this now reflects the increased negotiation power of the same state, right, over the communities of its own territory, and therefore this allows the state to centralize enough to provide properly everything in terms of training, equipment, supplies, etc., to an army that is just a national one in nature, right? It's just not yet mass by scale as would happen with the totalizing consequences of the French Revolution that eventually spread also in other countries, even if juridical, institutionally, in different forms, but still obliging fundamentally. This is a bit the history of France. It happened at the time of Louis XIV as much as it happened during the French Revolutionary Wars, right? All Europe needing to coalesce in order to stem this human tide of French force that, by the way, came from a hell of a military culture throughout all French history. That is yet another thing. So as you understand, it's more complex than it sounds. But yes, we can see there a bit the difference. Taxes existed, of course, and a degree of centralization always was the case. When the question says, the Roman Republic required soldiers to provide their own armaments, right? Being a soldier was privileged and you to pay for your own kit. This is also ideal in nature, right? That's indeed what you find in history books, meaning that, yes, still there was this prevalent idea that you as, in that case, as a citizen already, because Rome was a city, but factually it stemmed from the fact that these people were warriors, right, were freemen, right? So it's an idea of the peoples in arms that was out there as a standard, right, even before the civic concept of the same, that had to say, we should go all together for defend our own interests as freemen. So as in theory, lots of people will agree just to do the same thing, and that's why you always need, even today, in today's times, the decisive moral force of a country to govern in the first place, and also to enact warfare. And this naturally makes you to wage warfare, and this naturally makes you reflect on the fact that no totalitarianism or dictatorship or authoritarian regime is the sole responsible as a government for what the people do, because without the people there couldn't be any totalitarianism, there couldn't be any dictatorship, there couldn't be any authoritarianism. And this is not a moment where the people hands power to the evil guy that steals it, doesn't give it back, right? It's literally the same people continuing to let the evil guy, because they are evil people themselves, to do what they do, right? And this is a narrative many people don't like because of ethno-nationalistic delusions, such as that, a country is inherently good or bad, and that this doesn't depend on what every decision that you make at the moment will bring to certain consequences, right? So the bullshit of people that went dying for their own country because they weren't really all like that. No, they were, because in the moment in which they were given a gun in their hands, they had a choice whether to turn it against the people who provided them or against those that they were told to kill, right? And of course, things get blurred in there because I don't know if you pick the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany. I mean, they were just two disgusting, evil totalitarianisms, and frankly, they should have kind of destroyed each other, much more greatly than other countries. Free countries were obliged to intervene for paying their own way. So there is really it's not really a matter of cheering for one side or another. It's properly realizing what was happening there, right? And picturing the horror and the degeneration that countries can do when they decide to give up, understanding reality for what it is, and they start believing in delusions and paying for it, right? For all what they deserve to pay, because that's actually also the deal. And in Roman Republican times, actually, and especially in Republican times properly meant, right? So think about the siege of Veii, the Camillian reforms, etc. So when we think, I made videos on this, theory, the republic. There was never such a thing like a republic as we intended. But we mostly associated in Roman history properly to the passage from a feudal Rome, essentially, to the one of, an army of people, right, that are provided in this sense properly with the right to bear arms, to provided with the imperium, which is in fact in the Camillian reform mirrored also by the conferment of the same faculty to popular magistrates, etc., that we associate the idea of the republic, so the people's army, right, of citizen soldiers that ideally still have to provide their own armament. Telling the truth, even in the legend of it, in the siege of Veii, you already find that the Roman army was provided with supplies, right, by the state, so much that that's what the Roman term miles, plural milites, actually means, because they were the ones who received literally the millet, the bread, and this they didn't have to bring from home. Like some provisions, yes, there are some military organizations always were based on private resources, right? But you cannot fundamentally have an army as much as you can not have a community if you don't have a pre-arranged level of, centralization and organization and stocked supplies that you eventually have to provide to these people. It's a bit the same reason why, I don't know, think about the Germans, the ancient Germans that, were estimated freedom in their own way, meaning that, just the local mobsters were free to do whatever the hell they wanted in their own land, on their own people, but they didn't want any overlord to tell them what to do, but they would rationally elect a single leader. They feared very much in these prerogatives. Look at what Arminius did after the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. Basically tried to took over, eventually was taken out for the same reason, because surprise, surprise, in war one of the principles, or classical principles, is unit of command. Right, and if you don't have that, you really can't have a functional army. And so, of course, even in the first AD Germany, you would have a degree of centralization, even among Germanic tribes in their own military organization. It was a big deal, right? It's always based naturally on this, as we've said, participation, but of moral participation. But when we're talking properly of, unmassing lots of people in one place, right? There was not superstructure that the superstructure would, be able to provide that. It was all the single tribes joined, but these tribes had that degree of centralization in their own way in them. So it was true for the Romans, right? Because from that time onwards, and well before the Marian reforms that fundamentally unblock, right, this idea completely that the soldier has to bring his own equipment, albeit still legionnaires were to pay for the equipment they consumed and they received specifically. And this is something that went on. We find even in imperial times, it's always blurred actually, but already before that, and especially already before, when ever since Roman warfare had passed from seasonal to, permanent forces fundamentally stationed in the provinces, etc., of course, the troops you have to imagine, I don't know, the Italic legionnaire in the Spanish campaign of Scipio Africanus having to, to march from Italy with its own load of, of weapons and food, serving for, the entirety for years of campaign. Of course, it didn't work like that. It was already by far surpassed. It was not a thing. Literally, you can easily see, simply measuring the time these campaigns lasted, or the range of them. Of course, it was a superstructure. It was essentially the consuls that received the aerarium, from the state treasure, and that provided these troops already well before the Marian reforms, by the way, with equipment, right, with supplies especially. Sometimes they integrated this with the allies' resources where they campaigned, simply naturally looting them from the enemy, but it was already that statal reality. In fact, I made a video now, specifically I remember, about the creation of the Roman state that happened that early, right, by the 4th century BC fundamentally, and that already provides, and it was radically connected, as we've seen, to the creation of a large army, right? Of a large army would be active continuously, and that of course required that degree of central control. Aside naturally from the private means that were still employed in that regard. I mean, even if you look in the late Republican times after the Marian reform, where, I don't know, by the time of Cicero, we know that essentially there were not really statal fabrics, but fundamentally even in their privates, that the state subcontracted the production of weaponry and armor, etc. But fundamentally, if you look at that point in Roman history, the Senate factually didn't have any control on the empire anymore, right? It was all in the hands of these major warlords that, yes, were still operating by law, barely, let's say, so they were provided with magistracies, with the faculty of command to raise legions and all these things, but were also largely contributing with their own private assets. That is factually what eventually made the Roman armies at the time, right? While all the proletarians join in because they literally didn't have anything else. They were provided with the equipment, the training, etc., with the extremely violent and traumatic and abusive military training that made the Roman army the most effective in ancient civilization. And again, without which you cannot have a civilization, you cannot have an army of that quality still today. So the system was always mixed, right? It was always mixed in a way. It's also later on, when you look at the late Roman Empire, you realize that, and well, okay, we will have to talk about it later, so I will save it for later, but you see there that still, independently from, for example, the increase of bureaucracy and statal control on certain resources, especially on the territory, a tighter grip, still the system was there, it was integrated. The Annona, for example, wasn't much of an actual distribution at that point, but simply a settlement in certain lands that were connected to the Annona, so the supplying of the army with natural resources. Payment in nature was also a big deal. So the system was always mixed. And the same actually goes for the Middle Ages, right? But last example of the ancient world, at least for that chunk of the question, even I made videos on the Germanic comitatus, for example. And even in that reality, so literally a war band that is even nomadic in nature, because it's not rooted in any particular place, it tours the world, it gets a service of this or that power all over Europe, the Mediterranean, etc. The boss, the leader, the chieftain is the guy that administrates, for example, resources, because there a religious military bond for which the guy is factually the medium of the deity of war to which all these warriors have devoted, and therefore handed any kind of individual freedom too, because the moment they entered the war band, they didn't belong to themselves anymore. Of course, they belonged to the deity of war and factually to the leader, right? To which they owed blind obedience. And naturally, the higher the quality of the warband and the greater this obedience was, right? Naturally, it would also go on killing each other, but that was not really a good formula, and that's why the Comitatus was born, exactly to provide this radical mental alienation from any kind of consideration of personal safety or survival, whatever. They would even ritually sacrifice somebody, like the guy who arrived last at the meeting, just to prove to others, while butchering these people alive in front of everybody, that they were not human beings anymore, but just essentially an extension of the divinity. And that was the only way to maintain a disciplinary standard in a world like most of the tribal realities of Central and Northern Europe, where there wasn't any of substantial, consistency by, what, I don't know, for example, by the Roman standard at that time. And that had to work, right? But even in that, the guy was in control. For example, the loot that he would redistribute among his warriors, because he wanted them well equipped, because they had deserved it, because they were this extension of the day, they had deserved individually this because of their bravery, their courage. Is basically the only individualism allowed in there. How much you risk your life in combat. And that would be needed to be equipped, needed to be better served, better provided, gifted warriors in the band. So even that is a form of centralization, even in a nomadic reality, fundamentally. The same is true even in part from actually real nomadic people, right? Even in the steppe, there is something like that, in spite of the fluidity, the instability, but even in there, occupying certain territory, bring to certain control and certain resources, that is centralized by an elite, right? The others are just, at the outskirts of that, or they share it partially, but because there is an elite that commands. So wherever there is command, there is a form of centralization always, that in contemporary times sees a state that pays for the wall equipment, for the wall supplies for everything, right? And still the decisive element there is the moral forces that are brought there from the wall community, from the same people who join the army, and how motivated they are, and that's on the basis of which an army is factually an army, or just something that is going to melt away at the first cannon shot, right? So the question went on saying, in terms of understanding the rise of the Condottieri in Italy in particular, is it that? And there are 3 points to this. So I presume, because recently I made another video on the rise of mostly of the free companies, actually, not much of the Condottieri per se, but there also explained what it factually meant. And yes, it kind of began at that time, though, towards the end of the century. And also I uploaded something else years before, it re-uploaded recently, but yeah, so it's something I will have to come back at some point expanding, because it's a very important topic, and there is a very few out there about that. So about the rise of Condottieri in Italy, and it's always through a 14th century perspective here again. So the first sub-question is, armies were not fully statized until the 15th and 16th century, and it's just that our 14th century sources improve. So armies from the 15th and the 16th century begin to have an ever larger core of state-dependent troops, right? Completely dependent, meaning properly in command, in equipment, etc. And not a simple hiring of mercenaries that eventually, obey for that amount of time and just, eventually go away, maybe even in another country, right? To back in they're not properly available under the political control of the land, right? So that fully appears in the second half of the 17th century, right? Where at least that becomes the prevalent model, the prevalent, the idea that the army is now totally under the statal control, and the states rely fundamentally just on their statal armies per se, right? And not on some mercenary company that up to that point had been, looking at the 30 years war, kind of the normality, right? Even for important powers at that point. So what happens in the 15th and 16th century is that the nucleus of permanent troops fundamentally increases, right? The idea is that also here is a bit of a modernist bias. When did the first permanent armies start? Permanent armies existed, meaning in some degree of unit that was permanently upkept by a power. Again, ever since we have essentially a state, right? We can see it since Assyrian times, and it's not really, or even before, right? Even if there is not direct evidence of the procedures and how they were supplied, etc., but they were there, like palace guards, for example. They are a form of saddle arm, right? Of permanent force, right? These existed all over medieval times, right? It's just that by the 15th and the 16th century, the bulk of these troops increases. It increases a lot because states began to strengthen and to enlarge and to develop more, right? So this is exactly what happens. But these saddle armies are always in parallel with some private mercenary forces, right? That do not quite respond, if not through money, to the authority of a state as such, right? And again, as I was saying before, this is a bit of a blurred ground because of the Machiavellian stereotype and reinforced by 19th century Romanticism that the mercenary is a sort of turncoat that doesn't give a damn about the employer. It actually turns out that mercenaries remained for so long because they were most of the times the best troops available. And yes, in some cases they were not, particularly loyal, but this doesn't mean that politically or militarily this would make them less effective than a statal army, right? As a matter of fact, exactly the example of the Condottieri is the proof of this. The fact that, in fact, we're also saying Machiavellian bias starts from in a quite. Machiavelli was a hell of a thinker, right? But he was not particularly honest from a historical point of view, and indeed, it's one of the pillars of Western military theory, in political theory, of course. But concretely, by the 15th, 16th century, we mostly see after essentially, and it's difficult because we're talking here about feudal Europe, right? In the Middle Ages, there had been, there had already been something similar by a certain degree. Wherever you find, for example, think about the Byzantines, or thinking even about the Caliphate, right? There was a legacy of a statal legacy that fundamentally saw, yes, some consistent armies of troops were of free men slash at that point, yes, kind of subjects in the broader political culture of the time, but still fundamentally free subjects of a specific power that were not just levies called part-time for eventually coming back to their field, but properly professional troops, right? Of course, even in there would always be mercenaries, foreign mercenaries. These were particularly effective even for political reasons because they were mostly cut off from the rest of the community. They depended just on the sovereign, so they were tended to be loyal exactly in that sense. Very often they were also a different religion, for example, so that they wouldn't actually exploit the local the local religious factional disputes that, of course, were inherently political in nature. They would do the same, but still initially they were something like aliens that wouldn't find much sympathy even among the rest of the population. So independently from any country's event, but yes, by the 15th century we see first with the Swiss Confederacy and later by imitation, especially by France, the Empire, Spain, right, the rise of properly of what we call permanent professional armies that again, however, were always cited still in consistent numbers by mercenary forces. So that's not a full statalization, right? That again begins with Louis XIV's France, right? You have an army that is entirely French because it responds to the French monarch, right? And it's paid directly and funded by it, right? And that eventually is is still small comparatively, but it's still eventually French armies at that time become the largest ever seen. Right, again, all Europe had to form an alliance against France to stand that. But it's not still by scale what will happen with France 100 years later, when armies are going to be counted in hundreds of thousands of people, if not more. And at that point, you have a state that has literally taken everything over in terms properly of all the resources of the country, without this the previous idea that the fundamentally that it was just the king there as a guardian of the pre-existing communities that just theoretically obeyed to him if he performed this duty well, right? So again, it's blurred at some times, but if you look at it in a chronological perspective, it's actually very consistent changes by scale, right? So the Renaissance in this sense doesn't show a full statalization, right? And some countries naturally get closer to it than others, right? But also the same nature of the state here is somewhat disputable, and where if you look at their output in terms of properly production, taxes, was still very low, and that's why also they had to negotiate. They had to essentially subcontract to provide even for other privileges, or to ask even to foreign power for help, because there were some intersections even properly of monarchic interests across countries to elevate themselves as states above the rest of the community. Also here, as you understand, it's very blurred. So in this first sub-point, armies were not full, and it's just that our 14th century sources improve. I believe here it's what I was saying also before, that the 14th century doesn't actually see an improvement of sources, right? As a matter of fact, in the 14th century, sources go down. 14th century is the largest moment of crisis in the entire medieval millennium. It's a radical contraction of demographic and economical resources that brings, incidentally, to a reprivatization of warfare, right? And it takes, in fact, the mid-15th century before starting to have something more statal-like. The question, we'll see it now, is that up to that point, actually, there had been a statal process that, incidentally, it's what I've been researching in my doctoral research, and that has been neglected in medieval historiography worldwide for reasons that at some point I will explain more thoroughly, but that fundamentally obscured certain political, social, but also consequently military developments that were actually very much statal in nature, and that now we're going to observe. But by the mid-14th century, this thing had cracked, right? And therefore, the rise of the Condottieri later on, actually, is connected from that point onwards, actually, exactly to this, right? To actually a smaller, but if you want, more permanent paradox, even if they were mercenaries, right? So, and not statal troops as we intended, but they, say a tiny but good, like efficient force of professionals, right? That would spare to the rest of the community the burden of military service, in part because still that community was levied occasionally, right? So the Condottieri armies do not actually reflect much of a statalization as armies per se, because they were subcontracted to other that received the money for that, but fundamentally organized them on their own in the base of a private, is like a private business, right? Whereas what starts happening, and this is Italy in particular, that had actually had a very advanced statal development up to the early 14th century, and what starts happening from the 15th to 16th century is something else. Like, it's a bit the as we've seen, this major land masses such as France, the Empire, Spain, etc., that manage reinforcing the control on these lands and populations, are giants for times being, managed to put together, right, a core of troops that to be counted in the thousands, right? And sometimes more, right? Properly in the greatest amount of effort, but that was also unsustainable for a longer run. And it also depended on who you levied, frankly, because France, for example, would fail in having a national infantry up to the second half of the 16th century, right? Essentially for the preeminence of the aristocracy, so that France could levy an important amount of cavalry, of national cavalry and national artillery. But for the infantry, they had to recur to the Swiss, right? They were not French subjects, but had some advantages in that sense because they were professional mercenaries, and also when the war was over, they would come back to Switzerland, so they wouldn't bother as a as a class of veterans complaining for more rights and taking swords in hands if the monarchy wouldn't listen to them, and that was very advantageous. And the same reason why the Condottieri in Italy had been born, right? It was also the affirmation of the seigneury, so of leaders that didn't quite want the masses to be armed, right? This is easily seen in many contexts, right? Properly in the mid 14th century. Think about the Jacquerie in France, or the revolts of the Italian and the Flemish textile workers in the major European cities that are literally cut down by the local government because these people were not armed. They were just a mass of desperates that wouldn't even have properly a real class consciousness or anything, and of course was surpassed by the elite that at the time was by far the most advanced and open-minded and developed element of society that kept control of that. But that corresponds exactly to that refeudalization of warfare that is hardly a subtle direction, right? And just, in fact, that is particularly evident with the Condottieri in Italy, because the Italian city-states wouldn't have essentially a major landmass or too many people to arm, because they were already busy in other more remunerative activities, and therefore you have to wait for the largest European countries to start doing that later on, 1 century later at the earliest, but actually with great difficulty until finally in 17th century France a national army concretely just becomes the Schwerpunkt, right, of the military organization. So again, in 14th century sources wouldn't quite improve as such, right? And this often is, in other historical times, we'll see now, a moment in which the state does intervene in some fields of society. There is actually the continuation of state building, and an improvement, also the same, tightening if you want, even reinforcement, but not quite in the investing necessarily in the creation of a statal army, right? They're not directly proportional. So much, in fact, here there are other examples that fit this, because the other sub-point says, armies at some point, late Roman Empire, Longobards, become more statile, but then the events after the Lombard League in Italy cause a return to privatization. So the late Roman Empire, first of all, as I was just saying, there are moments of crisis where fundamentally bureaucracy increases because essentially resources are more difficult to control. The Roman Empire is threatened by barbarians at the frontiers. It suffers its own demographic and economic internal the crisis by a certain degree. There are properly deep political and social changes occurring. The state wants to maintain more direct control on the military assets, properly the most populated area of the empire for levying manpower and the resources, the statal armories that concretely in the late Roman Empire are statalized, right? Differently from previous times, they were subcontracted, but they weren't quite statal in nature per se, right? And sometimes legionaries would actually produce their own weaponry themselves, also because it was, in the early empire, fundamentally a relatively peaceful moment, not a dramatic pressure on the empire in the first place to produce to unhinge like that kind of political social balance, also the existence of an active middle class, right? It was fundamentally by the late Roman Empire gone, right, because of all the crisis and so on. So the late Roman Empire army, does it become more statal in nature? Well, if we talk about the dependency of the armies on directly statally controlled means, yes, right? As before, there were more intermediaries for that. As for the statal nature of the army in itself, well, it had already been statal, and it keeps being statal, right? Also, late Roman Empire here can be different things. Like the Constantinian army was enormous, and it was all maintained by the state, and it was all controlled by the state properly. And so, but I don't know, if you look at the 6th century army at that point, you have actually like half of the army's mercenary nature. It depends on external peoples. Already, yeah, I mean, the Romans had always used more non-Roman citizens in their armies than Roman citizens since the very beginning. It's a myth also to consider the late Roman Empire as the moment in which the Romans made more use of mercenaries compared to previous times. Completely wrong. There was no Roman Germanization, for example, barbarization, if you prefer, of the Roman army. If anything, it was the contrary. It's those peoples that became more Romanized through the Roman army. It was, in fact, still the single most effective branch of the Roman state, and was a mind-blowing military machine that never quite lost its own capacity, as long as there was a state, right? You see, in the western half, the state fundamentally vanishes because literally local resources end by the 6th or the 5th century, actually pretty much later than it's usually thought. It wouldn't even have to end. There are dynamics there that depended literally on a single campaign, or namely at that point one led against in Spain against the Vandal intervention there, actually when the Visigoths had already been subjugated, for example, again. So that is the case. In the East, structures remain more intact, but there is an increased reliance on certain, there is, for example, less order in a way, even just organizationally speaking. If you look at Justinian's army, there were certain rearrangements, but it's still this, older units, older corps that, all kind of mixed together, new mercenaries in. So the Roman army still exists as such, but, it's not really more statal in the means that the same state can exercise control on the same empire than it had been before, right? In relative terms, it's much more intense in certain areas where there are properly the strategic assets of the empire. But in surroundings, it's more or less, let's have some deterrent control on it, but let's not expect miracles, because properly that's not even where our, balance fundamentally rests. So indeed, in early medieval times, we see a privatization, rather, of the military systems. Here, the question named the Longobards, presumably because I have made consistent videos about the Longobards, and the Longobards are just an example of any other Romano-Germanic kingdom that fundamentally was Germanic in its own political institutional culture, hence also in its military administration. Fundamentally, even in there, it was a bit like before, it was the tribe, was the idea of the people in arms, right? So that there was a king who was elected by the people in a military function, ideally, so that, this was the guy that had just to rule in times of trouble, and theoretically the people was free. The Longobards, as this another thing that is often overlooked, is actually carried out. Many people don't understand this because they still rely on, at this point, 75 years old historiography, and they do not even remotely know what is being properly rewritten as discovered and properly confirmed and debunked in opposite on the Longobards, that had definitely the most advanced state, civically speaking, in Latin Germanic Europe, right, compared to any other were there, right? The Franks and the Visigoths had much more privatized kind of proto-feudal systems already at that point. The Anglo-Saxons had basically were all fragmented different kingdoms. The Longobards had an actual state. They had an actual public administration with an educated elite that and royal officers, and they had a wealth distribution for which there was no private elite that could effectively compete for power, if not by passing through the channel of public administration. This was a very good system, but it was not warlike, right? It was this is more or less what happens to all the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. Like, yes, the Germans arrive, and in theory they are all peoples in arms. They have this very hard pressure received from the Barbaricum, from places where they could be wiped out from a second to another, and therefore they had always to be ready to fight. But as soon, of course, as they settle in most developed lands, they gentrify, and they lose that kind of attitude to war. Naturally, these were still kind of warlike societies for our own standards, right? There was violence, there was, an aptitude to arms, right? But the difference between, a permanent professional military and these ones who were essentially part-time militias is very evident, right? A tiny elite of these people would be somewhat professional in nature, but they didn't make it a consistent military class. This is true for basically any people in Latin Germanic Europe except the Franks. The Franks are much more feudal in nature. For this reason, paradoxically, they manage to put together, for expansionistic reasons, an ultra-elite, right, that is really an elite, even quantitatively speaking. But since the Franks have an empire, so it's not a tiny land just like the Anglo-Saxon or Lombard kingdom, right, that they are, just like one of the countries that the Franks control all around them. So that's properly an imperial system that exploits the resources and manages to provide, for local standards, a very tiny elite, actually, that owns almost everything, and all the others work for the professional, lifestyle as mounted heavy cavalry, right? But the country is so large, this enormous, fertile and populated Atlantic plains stretching from Spain to Saxony practically, and they conquer, as you know, they expand further in this time. So what they can put all together in absolute terms is still a remarkable force of, there are huge debates on the size of Carolingian armies, but it's not unfair to say that at least the top capacities of these armies could reach in the thousands of professional troops, speaking especially of cavalry, whereas the rest was just local levies that would be occasionally recruited. And by the way, with a rota system, right? It was present actually in any Latin Germanic country, like many others, so that, of course, if, of three peasants, I don't know, one went to war, the other two had, and him had to provide the equipment for the guy who went, and I don't know, one expedition, one guy went, and then another went, or wherever, but still there were at least other people working the land, because that's also where you get the resources, the supplies for this insanely, massive logistical systems that the Carolingians managed to put together because of this enormous amount of men and material. So there is hardly anything statal. I don't know here whether Lombards, given that eventually talk about the Lombard League, is meant really about the Lombards, like the medieval, like the high medieval northern Italian city-states, or of the Longobards proper as such. I explained the Longobards now, since we have to pass anyway to the Lombard League. That's something earned already and added. So no, I wouldn't say that in early medieval times there had been a process of statalization. If anything, it's the other train, right? And this is all. I mean, maybe the question, the acknowledge that. It's just, the Lombards, they are like this, connected to the late Roman Empire. It's obviously towards the early medieval time. So, evidently, at that point, there is a proto-feudalism developing into what the fullest form is seen later on. And the question here says, but then the events after the Lombard League in Italy cause a return to privatization. So, here the question, if strictly speaking, is correct, meaning the events after the Lombard League in Italy cause a return to privatization. So, first of all, we should point out what we're talking about relatively to the Lombard League proper, because what historiographically speaking we address to as the Lombard League is fundamentally this coalition of northern Italian city-states in two major phases of wars that are the ones against Frederick I Barbarossa in the second half of the 12th century, and then against Frederick II, his grandson, in the first half of the 13th, right? So there was also the Veronese League, etc. But let's take it by this broader Northern Italian alliance that objectively, yes, fought here. We're talking about multiple cities together, right? And as far as studied about the Lombard League, these cities didn't have like a much of a sort of structural organization in place. Like, they mostly coordinated each other as individual city-states. Of course, even in there was something put in common, but the solidity of the individual city-state was enough at that point to provide a coherent, orderly, cooperation with the others without too much, put in common. This is something different from, for example, the Tuscan leagues of the first half of the 14th century, that instead tended literally to create mercenary armies by paying all together for hiring somebody. But even in there, it was mixed with actual communal armies, so the armies of the single city-states, properly as citizens, as peasant levies, and so on. And so, what happened fundamentally? So the Lombards defeated both times the German armies in the attempt of bringing the Italic kingdom again under the control of the Germanic emperors across the Alps. So this is an astonishing chapter in medieval military history. We haven't even talked about that much about it, and it's actually crucial instead. And it does prove there exactly true these wars against the Hohenstaufen, actually the real transformation of the Italian communes into real city-states per se, right? The commune is also something coming together of different components of the city, of the countryside, etc. But the creation of a state, like properly of a centralized system, does occur here, and it's remarkable. There is I made some videos explaining the how it happened concretely, right? It's actually after, in fact, the Lombard League as we intended here. So essentially in the second half of the 13th century that the Italian city-states reach the peak of, if you want, a civic statalization. That means that the people fundamentally takes over power from the professional military elite, right, that ruled a bit like the feudal element in the Italian society, and creates literally centralized institutions that, in that sense, expand also the control in the countryside, etc., and put together armies that are even much larger, actually, than the ones fielded during the wars against the Swabians, right? Because in Swabian times, like during the times of the two major Lombard leagues, the Italian armies were very well structured, but alongside the normal balance, let's say, between kind of some, this military elite of knights that eventually were followed by the the commoners, the infantrymen, right? And albeit at that time the Italian infantries were the most developed in Europe, it would between the 12th and 13th century. The Italians never had a thing like like it happened in Flanders or in Switzerland or in Scotland, in the German Dithmarschen, etc., where a solely based infantry army manages to defeat a cavalry army. Like the Italian infantries manage to resist for entire days, astonishingly, something that was inconceivable at the time, against the cavalry charges of the imperial knights, right, repeatedly, right, and that's something that blows the mind of all the of all Europeans at that point, because nobody had even properly the guts or the idea of thinking, let's say, how can a commoner do this, right? But at the end of the day, it's always the Italian cavalry that manages to collect the victory, right, that makes it decisive, gives a decisive blow, right? And so there is a balance there that is maintained. So what actually happens in the second half of the 13th century and up to, let's say, for a good part of the first half of the 14th, is that Italian armies expanded dramatically. Not just the Italians. After the Hohenstaufen extinguished, and essentially it was the German interregnum, and therefore nobody really reinvaded Italy anymore. They start fighting each other predictably, independently from eventually the expansion of Angevin and Germany from Naples and with the Papal Alliance. There's always some inter-city struggle that or some of it, in which much larger resources were invested from the times of the Lombard League, also because the Italian city-states are booming, literally. And again, this goes in parallel with what is being historiographically conceived with the peak of communal civilization, this dramatic, in fact, a statal, juridical, artistical, scientific, technological development of the Italian city-states that reaches at that point a massive, it's something even historiographically speaking, we talk about this. At this point, Italy is fundamentally the leading European country in most of these fields, and it even provides with some sources, with some chronicles that are something astonishingly accurate, differently from, for example, normally the clerics of Northern Europe that wrote the things their own way, because those are citizens that not only were the politicians who decided war, had received magistracies, but also fought on the field, right? So we have a degree of accuracy and of even properly of community complexity that is unknown in any other European historiography at that point, documented but properly also existing in the country. And as a consequence, this system actually produced what historiography, for many reasons we don't have the time to digress on now, which was essentially a lack of interest both of the Italians and foreigners for this time in history, that just now is being, somebody's waking up finally, because we discovered, also thanks to me, that we missed maybe one of the greatest elephants in the room in the entire medieval warfare, and it's utterly embarrassing. It tells you, first of all, how few Westerners actually know their own history in the first place altogether. Secondly, how much, really historiography is not to be trusted that much, right? In perspective, nor thinking that we get things right just because we are in an advanced times. History is always to be interpreted, reinterpreted, and not necessarily the way we interpret it up to now even makes a lot of sense. Just think about the idea of the military revolution, that is this complete lack of perspective, because if somebody writes the military revolution is from the mid 15th century to essentially the mid 17th, at that point it's essentially of course 200 years of a very long process in that sense, and right after that you have literally a boom comparatively by scale that is the same one we were saying before about Louis XIV's army, that is overwhelms dramatically basically everything that has happened before in relative terms. And that's not a revolution. That is a revolution, because of course it was the usual progressistic, technologistic, modernistic, and also partly properly a Protestant and Northern European bias that the Renaissance was the moment in which it was the greatest progress in humankind. This is absolutely not really a thing, right? And it's reflected by this delusion that somewhat it was a military revolution just because, I don't know, firearms came into place. Like, it took 200 years to pass from the first shots to properly linear tactics. 200 years. How is this a revolution? How is this properly, even in the light of things had transformed before and later? It's very difficult to spot. Yes, there is an acceleration, but that's at best what you can say, right? But why a revolution? It was not a revolution. And also, this acceleration actually owes much more to medieval civilization in itself than to what happened later, but properly from a quantitative point of view, I mean from a political and social point of view. And yet we're still talking about that. And of course that tells you also properly how modernists sometimes completely don't have any scale properly. It would have made enormously more sense in historiography to have had the term revolution applied to it's a disgusting term, first of all, properly from an etymological point of view. I accept it just if you're talking about, I don't know, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. Those were iconically the term. It's like Byzantine. It's okay. We've done it. At this point, we use it. But properly, this novelties, this prima donnas, whining, crying because look at me, I invented the new historiographical perspective, and then it's even bullshit because you're cognitively dissonant at the point of not realizing that 200 years of gradual change has hardly anything to do with any revolution. That especially after that you have two major periods, like in fact from the second half of the 17th century onwards, throughout all the 18th century, eventually with the French Revolution and the nation state. Those are freaking things that you may say, especially the latter, saying, well, that may be a real revolution. And I have the avatar of von Clausewitz, and I have him back there on my closet, because that's what has produced civilizationally this enormous and dramatic intellectual, scientific, philosophical development and understanding of warfare, etc. Talking about oh my god, like the military revolution for the early modern age, it's utterly, and no other period, or at least with a success that has been by eco concentrated in that, is just a delusion. And it's frankly anti-educational. Like, it doesn't teach people to describe reality for what it is. It's just fireworks and letting people pretend that and just, of course, we know what we are talking about the scholar that we're all thankful to, but and that probably also honest at certain levels, but that has made this mess. And any person that writes about those times has to pass through this perspective instead of simply passing it by, because it's completely useless, right? Aside from the objective data gathered and eventually just misinterpreted in that sense, right? And that comes naturally from the lack of a diachronic and comparative education that military historians should have. All military historians should have. Instead, basically nobody has. Also, because most of the people who claim themselves to be military historians are factually not military historians, meaning that they haven't really received that kind of preliminary fundamentals that are necessary to have even a valid method of inquiry for understanding military history. So what you see in late, the late 13th and first half of 14th century Italy, so in a moment in which technically the Lombard League still existed, meaning that the Lombard city-states were, still cooperating in a way, as always, but not quite the Lombard League that we think of against the Hohenstaufen, produced armies, by the way, all over the communal world. Like, this was homogeneous all over. It was present in Lombardy, in Tuscany, in the northeast. It was everywhere communal civilization was then, were able to field, sometimes individually, especially in the case of the larger cities like Milan or Florence, right, or the papal, the papacy altogether that didn't quite have a real base in that, but they had enough money to field, etc. Armies that count 30,000 men. 30,000 men, of which, or even more, by the way, because numbers are difficult to calculate, but fundamentally of which you have something like a core of some thousands of knights, professional knights, and then you have infantry wings, right? And on each cavalry line, there are usually 3. So we're talking about, let's say, wings that at this point count something like 5,000 men, or at least in the range of the thousands of men, all equipped with pikes, and also there is a part of them is crossbowmen, etc. But fundamentally, we're talking about tens of thousands of pikemen documented in the Italia, in these kind of head money that was laid with various cities for raising these troops, that are able to maintain the pace on the flanks of cavalry in battle, that are not frontally broken, but fundamentally by enemy crossbow fire. So combined arms actually with and cavalry charge together, for which basically if you don't break those wings, the cavalry clash can't quite go through. So but normally what happens is that some of these wings would collapse, mostly because of crossbow fire, and this wing's enveloping eventually the cavalry was still fighting in the center, proving the core strength of this infantry. That I repeat it, here we are talking about thousands of pikemen. Does it remind you anything? There is none of this in medieval civilization until fundamentally the Swiss in the mid-15th century. Well, the Italians had it for at least documented regularly and systematized, so as the thing had already happened, had already been born before, and died out later on for at least 40 years systematically. Which means that at some point the peak of medieval civilization in Italy brought to something that was dramatically close to the later modern pike squares that nobody has documented, meaning that the story of those battles, there were even many, are there, very well documented. But again, very few people studied this in the first place. And there are normal episodes, like if you Google, go Wikipedia, search for these battles, they're there, right? The books have been written, etc., but not from a strictly military point of view. Nobody cared about making a tactical analysis between these things. I did, incidentally. It took 700 pages to do this, and believe me, translating not much Italian vernacular, but pre-humanistic Latin is not really, reading the entire chronogram production of the Italian peninsula is, like I stayed in my house locked for 4 years essentially to carry this out, and I will be publishing this at some point, and with an incredible level of statal control on these armies that are properly, they're statal, meaning these people, the knights tend to be initially their city, their citizens, they're the city nobility. Eventually, this is the moment of affirmation we explained in the video on the Condottieri, of properly, initially the Germans, en masse, right, as mercenaries. The infantry is all Italian, though. And it's all like citizens and peasants, because that was the major divide, and probably in equal numbers, or at least, maybe more peasants, but we don't really have a reliable data on this, and we don't have a reliable data, by the way, on how these troops were actually trained and how they were actually equipped, which is crucial in the understanding of a statal army. We know that at that point the Italian city-states were literally the richest communities in the entire world, and that they had, they spent easily millions of florins for these wars. Is all documented, historiographically speaking, and so they would use these armies continuously, meaning that this was factually, this has been noted already before by Contamine, by other military historians, factually the most military active country in Europe at the time. Again, nobody gave a damn about that. And part of the reason why nobody gave a damn about that is that, again, the Italians kept using cavalry together with infantry. That is to say, in the early 14th century, everybody went crazy historiographically for the Flemish, for the Swiss, for whoever, broke cavalry alone as infantry. Because infantry is the future, the teleology of the freedom of the democracy. Unfortunately, by the mid-14th century, as saying before, this thing got cut down. Again, what actually happens is that in mid-15th century, the Swiss provide this saddle model their own way, which literally is at that point controlling a community, and also eventually the Swiss, get surpassed again by the French, especially by the Habsburgs, but also by the Spanish. And that system becomes something else, right? Also with more integrated army synergy, and so because the Swiss were basically just pikemen, the Spanish eventually is those that literally developed fixed, to their full maturity, the pike and shot tactics with Gonzalo de Cordova and so on. But again, if I say Gonzalo de Cordova, most people don't even know that he was the greatest commander in the history of modern Europe. Right, and this is not even a matter. Has nothing to do with personal opinions. This is properly studying what these people did at the time, and you don't find specialists or audience that are capable of understanding this because factually they don't study these things. They have never heard them. Part of the reason why I'm here is to say it, right? That we lost a massive, not a page or 2 or 10 or 20, a massive chapter in medieval military history because of these, people literally turning their heads or not being interested, maybe in a country rather than another, right? So, as I was saying before, how do we put it with these Italian armies? Because, again, all the fame there is for the Lombard League because they withstood the German invaders. Okay. But aside from the heroism, the romanticism, etc., but in terms of scientific military understanding, do you realize what it means? What happened by the late 13th, the early 14th century in these Italian city-states? This is still not understood. This is not being studied, it's not being researched, and it's under everybody's eyes because, again, it just takes to read the Villani or to read any kind of chronicle of the time. They told you. There were tens of thousands of pikemen there. There's no other medieval army that did this, right? And this is also a big deal because factually, from a tactical point of view, this not just the strongest army, not just in medieval history, but in the entire world history is the English army of Edward III and its continuation, let's say. This is also not a matter of personal opinion, it's pure maths. Calculate what were the odds numerically of the English armies against the French one during the 100 Years' War, and you'll find that this system worked like hell, right? And there is no other army in history that went even close to those numbers, right? This has nothing to do, I love the Roman army, for example. I love, the Dutch army between the late 17th, the early 18th century, the French army, right, or the Swedish army of the early 18th. I love everybody that displayed what is called civilization, that is properly the greatest expression of the dignity of human intelligence. And most people don't study history even like that because they study just from what country they come from, and that tells you the degree of their mental deficiency. But properly, here there is to rewrite a lot of stuff. And this Italian armies at the time were, by the way, the expression of a real state at that point. It had really consolidated exactly by those years, and that was they are called now by historiography people's seigneuries, because fundamentally it was the so-called people that is not quite, as you would imagine, the world commoners, but fundamentally the oligarchy of the merchants mostly, etc. But they mostly called this lords. That's how the seigneuries began in practice, and especially in some cities that were more republican in nature. They coexisted, right, without the lord taking over as an an autocrat, but which is never quite the case. In fact, these medieval armies are all completely heterogeneous. By the way, the French called this Tuscan Lombard Romagnol mercenaries to fight against Flemish infantry after Courtrai, and they even scored an important success. Again, nobody gives a damn. So here we're talking about formations of thousands of pikemen drilled to manage to move, to operate on the field, sticking in formation next to cavalry, not breaking, and even being able to envelop the enemy. Do you have an idea of the degree of collective training for any formation, and especially one armed with pikemen, that requires such tactics? It's an early time, so we're not so documented. For example, we don't know who gave them this equipment. Obviously, the state. It's just that we don't know how. Probably it's like a bit in modern days, which, I don't know, when people have weapons in their own house, right? But this was originally given by the state. There were still private means, of course, in parallel with this. This is also effectively documented. But here we're talking about a statal army, fundamentally, provided with a substantial amount of hardware, of material properly, but especially with a training, especially with a moral force that was able to maintain this connection. And again, since the Italians kept operating regularly with a very refined combined system of cavalry, pikemen, and crossbows, they would never, of course, have any, these were the expression of real states, florid, stratified, hierarchized one. They were not the Flemish commoners that were just, infantry, and they were to fight just as infantrymen, and basically they win just at Courtrai and barely at Mont-en-Pévèle, and that basically they get defeated in any single battle from there to the early 16th century, because they kept fighting like that. But since, in Italy you don't find a victory against cavalry, because every army had cavalry, therefore it would have been foolish to use infantry if you had something so powerful like cavalry. Again, nobody cared. And you say, so what did the Flemish win? Moral forces, because if people had studied von Clausewitz, they would know that it's not much how you fight in terms of, of tactical articulation or whatever. That is important, especially when you have a combined armed tactics that reveals a degree of an advancement in military culture. That is very effective in itself. But again, if you're not motivated, or if you don't have a specific reason, in fact, in that sense, to even fight against cavalry, it's not a point. It's not a problem, right? It would have been, the Flemish at Courtrai would have very much liked to have cavalry from their side if they had it with them, right? En masse win 10, because they had knights technically, but there were too few, and they sided among the infantry, even as elite, as aristocrats, because they had to set the good example, as the Counts of Flanders, talking about the Dampierre. But again, and this is a completely forgotten chapter. So actually what happens by the mid-14th century, also in Italy, by the way, is that this infantry gradually starts disappearing, right? We know that infantry was there because there were never infantries in Europe without, just with cavalry or infantry. You can know certainly that every kind of army, and I mean every kind of one, had always cavalry and infantry. It's just that after this massive deployment regularly in battle of tens of thousands of drilled pikemen and crossbowmen, you see a shrinking of this. And part of the reason is that Italy consumed itself, like other countries, at the same time during this period of crisis, of demographic and economical contraction, and of war was pretty intense at the time, probably throughout this dynamic, to the same war. So the commoners became poorer. You can see it starts from the chronicler that, they were always more elite and tending toward humanism. That is to say, not the citizen, soldier, magistrate, politician, but essentially the courtier in the house of a lord. That writes, in fact, Renaissance Italian chronicles are much different. In fact, much less insightful in this, even about military details. In fact, compared to the ones of the early 14th century, exactly because of this dynamic. Because they weren't the same people anymore. And properly, the citizenry, the peasantry had exhausted itself. All these wars were ravaging the countryside. So first of all, the peasantry, the bulk of, at least numerically, of these armies would be exhausted, because the local peasants were provided these weapons themselves, which is even more remarkable if you consider the fact that they were essentially arming the lower strata of the population, or at least these people had weapons by themselves, or probably they also given at some point, because probably they wouldn't arm the whole populace, but the populace at this point was already organized in a paramilitary fashion, right? So in fact, within the city walls, infantry remains actually very powerful, and it's just outside that armies start transitioning into what we see stereotypically as the Condottieri ones. That is, a lot of cavalry with a few relatively few infantry, not necessarily less than cavalry, which is kind of unusual in a way, but still the idea that all that massive apparatus was eventually too costly at some point disappeared. Also, the citizenry didn't really want to go risk their lives anymore. There were the Italian lordships at this point create a regional control over various cities. They disarmed them and they just make them pay money, and they hire mercenaries, so not to arm them again because they could rebel. So it all fits in the broader interpretation. It's just that this thing passed unnoticed, mostly by historiography, as a peak of statal army development. And so with the Condottieri, we have a sort of refeudalization, because it's fundamentally heavy cavalry. It's fundamentally at the service of the lordships. It's a subcontracted military unit in itself, right? Independently from whether we're talking about the earliest companies of few tens of men, or later the 15th century entire armies provided with all the properly the artillery, the whole package, let's say, tactically speaking. And surely even the late Italian, let's say let's say at the eve of the wars of Italy, right? Italian armies were not that bad, right? They were technically different from, in this sense, the French armies were at this point starting, as the question pointed out, in fact, to be more statalized in nature, properly arm a consistent amount of subjects, because diluted in a broader France that was affordable, whereas the Italians wouldn't like to do that, but they still spent an atrocious amount of money for their military, which was not really that bad. Think about the Battle of Fornovo, which the Italians and the French basically bleed each other white, and nobody really wins or loses. But morally, Italy loses because it was showed that basically a foreign army could enter the peninsula, go straight through without unopposed, and just having this tail strike at the end, right? And so everybody poured in, right? But even in there, it's a political crisis, it's a moral crisis. It's not about the army formula in itself, right? If ideally the Italian states had been all cohesive for some reason in that sense, instead of essentially minding their own business, finding their other connections also abroad for their own interest. But easily, nobody could have stepped south of the Alps. But this is quite easy to see. Even properly during the 14th and 15th, and nobody did. There were expeditions there, but they were essentially founded by the same Italians to support these foreign monarchs against one another, and they were nothing by the scale of the Orange Southern times, right? And they were largely Italian armies themselves fighting against each other. So you understand how complex it can be. So I know this set of questions, I say it, maintaining naturally the privacy of my follower, is that it stemmed from a comparative need to say, which I felt personally very much, because I think there are a lot of parallelisms between today's times and the first half of the 14th century as a moment of crisis, contraction, and if you want, a strengthening of some statal capacities, right? Because what I forgot to say here is that in Condottieri's times, the state was consolidating in a way, but it was not doing it in an expansionistic sense, right? It was in a conservative sense. It was the idea we just spend for those condottieri, and then we mind our own business, we make our own money because we simply have the control on the traffics, and we don't need to conquer other lands to become richer and richer. But we fundamentally, they all counterbalance each other, so that in that case no regional state would prevail within Italy itself against one another. And was not really a land mass expansion would allow the later modern armies to provide all these, massive armies of thousands of professional troops again, right? Before the tens of heavily drilled troops were documented for the early 14th century were not professional, right? But they had a training that went dramatically close to it, given their performance, tactically speaking. It's just we don't know enough, but we may have missed the degree of how advanced that was. So comparatively speaking, yes, there are lots of similarities with today, but still there is a some things to point out. Like what I see today, for example, in terms of state, is that states are consolidating in their control on the populace, and this mostly has to do with the moral dimension. There is a moment of contraction, right? We see it worldwide. There are some emerging powers, yes, but there is also a need to consolidate and to control more the single state. So this is happening everywhere, and there is a lot of debate about this because it doesn't seem very promising in ideological terms, right? But governments are riding, in a sense, this kind of fear and emotionalism of the masses in front of a crisis and the exhaustion, right? And it's a bit exactly what was happening at the time we just documented in the mid-14th century, right? So I see a lot of comparative aspects there, and I believe there's going to be a greater compaction of the statal identities, but also for an important time a reduction of the actual capacities to project this power elsewhere, because we will find much harder opponents territorially based here and there in the world, and still not such a great economy to say, okay, there is room for another, even violent if necessary, expansion somewhere or resolution in that sense, right? And still we have to cope with other emerging powers that are in part exploiting this weakness, but also finding themselves in similar terms in a way when they get there and their drive kind of decreases. So they're interesting moments, frankly, but also different from those times because, okay, we can't digress too much. But the last point of the question were, so to finish actually with the second point, it was a return to privatization. Yes, in a way, but only like 1 century later, the most important phase of the Lombard League, because things had gone on for other 3 or 4 generations at least towards the consolidation of a state, right? And effectively, the state that you find in late medieval Italy was consolidated mostly between the late 13th and the early 14th century, right? This was set properly in its basis. Before you had just all these essentially 30 city-states warring against one another. At the end of the period, you have essentially just 3 or 4 major powers that ruled from a city over many other cities around that can't quite expand much further territorially against one another, and they don't even want to spend too much in that. They just want to grow fat and rich without developing that kind of superstructural systems that you find, for example, in monarchies like France, right? As we were saying before, that by the end of the Middle Ages is a real state, and that in fact had that dramatic military capacity. Also later on would keep proving historically in the centuries. Then the last point is, were armies in the 14th century simply becoming more statal in nature compared to armies of earlier times? For example, the 12th century. Well, overall, yes, right? Overall, there is, for example, during in the mid, like it was, the 50s of the 14th century, the French, at some point, they were warring against the English. They stopped, for example, disbanding armies after the war. They leave them billeted somewhere, and then until the following year. So people say, this shows like the idea of the increase of a statal army, meaning that they increased fundamentally the force of that they began to invest properly more in maintaining some troops and supplying them by a certain degree in a permanent fashion. Yes, this is a very timid beginning, but it began like that indeed. We're talking about the Western, especially Northwestern, also Spain can fit that, I would say, perspective. Yes, I mean, and altogether, also in Central Europe, right, there is an increase, right, of of a statal army, right, in nature. Yes, I would say so during the 12th century, because the 12th century was much more feudal, properly, in connection, right, and but at the same time, I would say that, like, in fact, the 14th century was maybe this was surely the result of that territorialization of power that provided for, if you want, less but kind of more stable resources that could be organized in something more permanent, more methodical and less contingent than before. Surely more in the 12th century. 12th century was feudal. Literally, it was a matter of just even finding the funds to pay somebody for the service, and whoever could come and join it was better. So in the 14th century, yes, there is some kind of increase in the subtle nature of armies, but it's still mostly based on the idea of a subcontract of some sort. Like in other words, it's mostly, yes, there is something that depends on like a national army made of the people locally, but still there are so many more mercenaries that makes the whole thing appearing, if you want, more of a, it's more our modern interests for saying where did it begin, rather than a real beginning, a real wanted or teleological, even wanted properly beginning at the time, right? And the refeudalization of warfare in this sense is to be mostly understood in the idea that, of course, before there were communities that were somewhat freer, and therefore they could come to something closer, like a people's army. It's like a bit the Swiss, for example. The Swiss in the early 14th century, they gained their independence. Fundamentally, they keep struggling for it. But they managed to preserve. They emerged at that time, right? And they saw themselves as this, of course, confederacy of free communities that decided to preserve their own freedom and in arms, by the way. So with this very strong connection between the political and the military action, of course. So that model, for example, is very different from the mid 14th century French kings paid troops that are essentially kept being paid, right, for longer. Right? So the same Swiss model, in fact, if you think about it, it kind of survived because the Swiss were not even some of the most, say the strongest forces that emerged in the 14th century. They were advantaged by the relative decentralization of the country, by the territory itself, by the political fragmentation of Germany at the time. And so they were clever to exploit. It's like the Flemish, right? They were decentralized compared to both the Empire and France, right? France also was not faring dramatically well economically. So there are certain systemic dynamics that bring to these peoples to emerge, but eventually they don't create aggressive states that are managed to, to fund ever more armies to go out there conquering other peoples. Of course, that's a matter of, it's also a cultural matter. It's like what needs did the Swiss, it's a bit like the Italians before, like, what need did they have to conquer other countries? Like, was it a good investment? It probably wasn't for the Swiss, wasn't for the Italians. For the French, that had, for example, this enormous landmass to control and were unavoidably historically brought to defend it in a way or another, and to search even through invasion to consolidate this power internally, well, because it was a big deal to keep together, well, a completely different military culture emerges. That, however, incidentally, is the winning one, right? Especially in Europe, the French one is indeed the ones that historically had the most persistent and consistent quality since, you can argue, since the Merovingian times, in a way, or Carolingian times, if you prefer. But so the statal nature of it is still far from a mentality, in a way. I mean, the monarchy surely seeks for that, because the monarchs wanted always to fund larger armies, and it's the communities that say, wait a minute, you have to do it first of all with our resources. If we don't want, you can't do it, right? So that's all the struggle that literally lasts until very late in time. Again, as we were saying before, the Middle Ages in this sense ends with the French Revolution or the end of the First World War, in between that time, because the idea of an aristocratic class, especially, that had the prerogative over these appointments, etc., it was a prominent feature in the organization of the armies, and that's not really statal in nature. That's really aristocratic. It's rather still connected to the idea of a of an allegiance to a ruler rather than to a national identity per se, right? And so, statally speaking, yes. Unavoidably, the larger system is also the one that, independently from its cultural background, produces more modernity in that regard. But at the same time, the 14th century is not even dramatically more impacting or particularly, predisposed to that idea of statal army that when you think, right? And not even the 15th or 16th century, at the end of the day, are much of that. There is some greater need for uniformation, for putting things together, but the greatest problem is still finding the money that at that point are used, preferably most of the time, to hire mercenaries rather than national troops, right? For other reasons that are political in nature, right? But that cannot be simply measured just by, it depends on the internal balance of the country, in other words. So I think, yes, that this is the answer. Definitely in the 12th century, again, of course, it was much less of a state than in the 14th, right? These countries, especially the national monarchies, had consolidated further. They had a bourgeoisie now invested in, properly the administration, even in the control of the terrorists and times. Still, the nobility was there, though, and it was quite powerful, and mostly wanted to be paid at that point to serve, and they wanted to do it their own way, and they were distrustful of any other attempt at centralization. So it's really a big deal in perspective to observe. Another point that I was saying before is that, however, the most important thing here is never to think that the 14th century, in this sense, is, for example, necessarily the beginning of a linear increase in importance of infantry, right? Tendentially, it kind of began from there, but there were lots of ups and downs, and especially the military organization and the community background of infantry armies, as we've seen between the 14th and 15th century, were quite different. Again, the early 14th century ones were commoners and peasants literally spontaneously going out there without much of a military organization in the first place and battling to it. In the mid-15th century, starts having something like, there is a prince that has enough money to fund an important amount of often also of mercenary force. I mean, look at the Landsknechten. Even though they were conceived, as the same name tells, so the servants of the state, the land. Like here, in fact, it's even the cultural concept doesn't quite exist much of that. But the Habsburgs, albeit they were ruling a federation, so it's even there it's complex to properly say, what allegiance existed, because Germany at the time wasn't surely, nationally, very cohesive as such, and so mostly, I don't know, Maximilian that created the Landsknecht and such, as an Habsburg, he ruling mainly from Austria, would mostly hire, I don't know, Westphalians, people coming from essentially other countries, right? And this is something, for example, that remains up to very late in time. Like Prussian soldiers at the time, Frederick the Great, who were they? They were Polish, they were French, they were Italian, there was not really the idea of much of the national idea in itself, because the aristocracy of warfare was the idea that it was a sport for the monarchs, right? And not much of a people decision as such. So that's also important, because again, if we are talking just infrastructurally, if the state is able to serve properly a military, to maintain it, to fund it, yes, indeed, there is a subtle increase, there is a centralization indeed. But also the national character is important to understand, right? It's important to see that it was molded, that it took a long time. Still, especially in certain countries like Central Europe especially, the allegiances, the identities were not quite much there. Think about Wallenstein, think about, in fact, up to the Westphalia, as we were actually saying the other day in private, we're playing a game that was largely private in nature, right? It was contingent, and the main the main rise, of this kind of truly statile armies is the 18th century. Like France is a forerunner, but if you look, for example, at the Empire of Austria or Prussia, right? That, by the way, don't even, I mean, they were, the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollern were German rulers, but factually their countries were more non-German than German. Right, their capacity of intervening in Germany was ridiculous compared to the territories they controlled outside of the empire, because that was like their private possessions, whereas in Germany was, a very intricate reality that very gradually was kind of pushed together, brought together. And again, it's one of those countries, by the way, until which in 1918 you wouldn't actually find a single country, because Germany was factually like, how many crowns were there in Germany still at the time of the Kaiser. It was a very different thing from what we are habituated today, even in federal realities like Germany still today. So we have to be always careful, I would say, in any context whatsoever, to focus better on what is the factor that concretely made the thing work, more or less, right? You see, in this statile formation that we see now, what really matters at the end of the day is how much money could the state put together to pay the troops for it. And you see, it's very different compared to, let's say, having a universal empire like the Roman one, where you're basically acting alone, right? There are well-defined enemies, if you want, compared to who you are, right? And even in there, don't think that things weren't blurred at some levels. But if you are talking about, I don't know, early 16th century Europe, at that point, as a power, you may have so many other powers against you in a dramatically fragmented European political reality that at that point, having a statal or a private army may be of less impact than having a support of whichever type in the process, and this would spoil even certain countries, right? So certain wouldn't even have many resources in the first place. So that's why, for example, France took off so early and Germany not, and while Eastern Europe basically, you know, would take so much longer, but not because of